Let's discuss what's actually occurring in the Gulf right now, because the noise is deafening and the signal is weak, and most of what you're consuming today will be obsolete by tomorrow morning. Here's the current state. American strikes targeted Iranian territory again this week, Bushehr, Chabahar, and the airport at Iranshar, with the figure being cited somewhere around 90 targets, air defense systems, drone storage, missile infrastructure. Iran didn't remain passive. Within hours, alarms sounded in Kuwait and Bahrain. Missiles and drones were intercepted over Jordan. A tanker was ablaze off Oman's coast. This isn't speculation. This isn't one analyst's conjecture presented as fact. This is the shape of the last 72 hours, confirmed by multiple wire services, and it represents a serious degradation of what had been until days ago a fragile but genuine ceasefire. Now, the impulse when observing something like this unfold in real time is attempting to identify a single villain and a single motive. I want to resist that impulse momentarily because the actual picture is messier and more revealing than the villain narrative. And if you grasp the complexity, you'll actually be able to anticipate what happens next better than if you simply choose a side and advocate. Start with the trigger. Iran struck 3 vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz not through the corridor Tehran has designated its approved route, but along a path closer to the Omani coastline. One of them, a gas tanker, ignited. The other 2 sustained damage but continued moving. Within a day, Washington had revoked the license, permitting Iran to sell oil openly on the world market for dollars, a genuine concession that had been central to the interim deal, and launched a fresh wave of strikes. Iran responded by hitting American positions in Kuwait and Bahrain, then fired ballistic missiles at a Jordanian air base, all of it intercepted as far as we know, with only minor injuries from falling debris. But intercepted missiles still convey something. They indicate both sides are now willing to fire directly at each other's regional footprint, not just exchange strikes on Iranian soil and consider it settled. So what is this genuinely about? I'd suggest it's less a resumption of total conflict and more a dispute over who controls the choke point. Iran has effectively been declaring, "We will guarantee the safety of ships utilizing our approved corridor through the strait, and anyone who doesn't use it is legitimate target." The United States and Gulf states are declaring, "There will be no toll, no approved corridor, no permission structure. Freedom of navigation is not something Iran gets to regulate." That's a different argument than whether Iran still possesses the capacity to fight. It's an argument about sovereignty over a choke point that carries roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil and gas in. Peacetime and choke point disputes have a long, ugly history of persisting far past the point where either side can articulate what winning would resemble. Which brings me to the question nobody in Washington seems willing to answer explicitly. What is the actual objective here? Not the tactical objective, degrade this radar, destroy that missile battery, but the political one. If the goal was regime change, that door largely closed months ago. If the goal is simply attrition, simply making Iran bleed until it can't fight anymore, that's a strategy assuming American stockpiles and American public patience are more durable than Iranian resolve, and that's not a safe assumption. The US Navy itself has acknowledged in public testimony that it possesses more missile launch tubes than missiles to load in them. That's not a minor detail. That's the kind of admission indicating a military campaign is operating on inventory mathematics, not on strategy. And here's the historical pattern worth considering for a moment because it echoes uncomfortably with 1914. In the years before the First World War, there was a railway Berlin to Baghdad that the British Empire treated as an existential threat, not because the railway itself was going to conquer anyone, but because it represented an alternative to British control of sea lanes. Land routes bypassing the Royal Navy's stranglehold were to London as dangerous as a fleet. You don't need me to draw the parallel too explicitly, but it's there. Overland routes bypassing naval choke points have always terrified whoever holds the choke point, China's Belt and Road runs straight through Iran, and there was a strike this week on a rail link in Golestan province connecting Iranian rail to the Central Asian network toward China. Modest damage, not the kind of strike that alters the strategic picture. But strikes like that are rarely about the physical target, they're a message. In this case, probably a message to Beijing: we can reach the infrastructure that matters to you, even infrastructure 1,000 miles from any front line. Whether that message lands the way Washington hopes is a different question entirely. China has a functioning relationship with Iran built on oil and a shared interest in not depending on sea lanes patrolled by the US Navy. A single damaged rail bridge repaired within weeks is not going to dissolve that relationship. If anything, it reinforces precisely why Beijing wants redundant land routes in the first place, because someone might strike the first one. Now let's discuss the states caught in the middle, because Bahrain and Kuwait did not choose this fight. They're small, they host American bases, and that hosting arrangement has just made them targets in a conflict they have almost no ability to shape. There was speculation in the initial hours after this round of strikes that Gulf states themselves might have launched an attack on Iran, a deterrence play attempting to signal leave us alone by striking first. It's worth being candid about why that theory doesn't hold up well. These are tiny states with limited independent strike capability, hosting a superpower's military infrastructure, surrounded by a much larger power with demonstrated willingness to retaliate against exactly this kind of provocation. A small state doesn't usually pick a fight with a much larger neighbor by throwing the first punch unless it's secured serious backing in advance. What's far more consistent with the evidence is simpler and less dramatic. American strikes triggered Iranian retaliation against the bases these countries host, and in the fog of a fast-moving news cycle, state media claims, denials, contradictory reports within the same hour, it briefly appeared like something it wasn't. That confusion, by the way, is the norm in the first hours of any exchange like this, not the exception. The first report from any strike is usually wrong in some material way. And that's true whether you're discussing this week's confusion in the Gulf or events and conflicts going back generations. Fog doesn't discriminate by century. Let's widen the perspective because this didn't occur in isolation. This flared up during the funeral of Iran's supreme leader, who was killed earlier this year in strikes attributed to the US and Israel. That timing was not incidental to how it was received inside Iran, attacking during the mourning period for the country's highest religious authority is the kind of thing that hardens opposition rather than intimidates it. A population that might otherwise be exhausted by conflict can find fresh unity in a moment of grief. If the working theory in some policy circles is that enough pressure eventually produces capitulation, the funeral timing argues against that theory rather than for it. And this is happening while the American president is at a NATO summit in Turkey, which adds its own layer of complication because Turkey is engaging in a genuinely fascinating double game right now. Ankara is being courted with the possible sale of F-35 fighter jets, a sale Israel has lobbied vigorously against for years. At the exact moment, Israeli officials are using strikingly hostile language about Turkey, some of it explicitly comparing Erdogan's government to the Iranian regime as an existential threat. That's a genuine split, not a manufactured one. Washington seems to be attempting to purchase Turkish neutrality, stay out of any wider conflict, and in exchange receive access to advanced weapon systems and warmer treatment. Whether that inducement holds depends less on what Erdogan states publicly and more on Turkish domestic opinion, which by most accounts runs strongly sympathetic to the Palestinian and broader Muslim world side of these conflicts. A leader that popular and that shrewd doesn't surrender his negotiating leverage for a jet sale. He takes the jets and keeps his options open. There's also a live question about Syria and Lebanon in all of this, whether Turkish influence over Damascus might be leveraged to push the Syrian government into some kind of confrontation along the Lebanese border. I treat that one with genuine skepticism. A government still consolidating control over its own territory, still managing an unstable border with Israel and complicated relations with Kurdish forces, does not possess the bandwidth to open a second front to please an outside patron. Promises of cooperation in that kind of relationship tend to be vague, deniable, and mostly symbolic. Now the harder question, the one that actually determines where this proceeds, can the United States sustain an open-ended confrontation like this? And here the answer leans toward no, for reasons having nothing to do with battlefield performance and everything to do with balance sheets. Oil was sitting around $78 a barrel before this latest round, and there's a reasonable case it moves substantially higher if the strait remains contested, the kind of price level that feeds directly into inflation that was already running hot across the Western world. Watch the 10-year Treasury yield, not the battlefield maps. If you want to know how much runway this conflict really has, every serious voice in that market has been stating some version of the same thing for months. Cross a certain threshold on borrowing costs and you're not managing a conflict anymore. You're managing a financial crisis that happens to have a conflict attached to it. Add to that the plain fact that both Iran and, by most assessments, Russia have moved towards something closer to full wartime mobilization, industrial base, population, messaging, all oriented around sustained conflict, while the United States has not made that shift at all, committing a fraction of naval and air assets to an open-ended campaign while your adversary mobilizes completely is a mismatch that tends to resolve in favor of whoever actually organized for the prolonged fight, history's judgment on staying power being fairly unsentimental on that point. There's a domestic political layer sitting underneath all this that's worth naming plainly because it explains behavior that otherwise appears contradictory. There's an interpretation and it's a contested one, so take it as one reading among several rather than settled fact that continuing a hard line against Iran serves a precedence. Domestic coalition building more than it serves any coherent regional strategy, that the political costs of appearing to back down are, in this view, higher than the costs of continued military action, especially heading into a midterm cycle where alienating a well-organized and well-funded political base could cost more than any battlefield setback. Other observers push back hard on that framing, arguing it overstates the influence of any single domestic lobby and understates genuine strategic calculations inside the administration about deterrence and credibility. I'd flag both interpretations and let you weigh them, because the honest answer is we don't have full visibility into which motive is actually driving decisions at any given moment, probably some blend of both. What we can state with more confidence is the pattern of escalation itself. Promising de-escalation in one breath, there was a genuine moment where a ceasefire framework got signed and briefly held, and then reversing course days later toward more strikes, more targets, harder rhetoric. That inconsistency is its own kind of signal. It suggests a policy being made reactively, strike by strike, rather than one following a settled endgame. And a conflict run reactively without an agreed destination is exactly the kind of conflict that persists longer than anyone intended, because nobody involved can articulate the conditions under which they'd stop. One more thread, because it's connected whether people want to acknowledge it or not. The parallel escalation in Ukraine. The same week as this Gulf flare-up, there's been authorization reported, not yet fully confirmed in every detail, for deeper Ukrainian strikes into Russian territory, hitting refineries alongside renewed discussion of licensing Patriot missile production inside Ukraine itself. On paper, that sounds like it strengthens Ukraine's position. In practice, building that kind of production capacity takes years, not months, and any factory established for that purpose becomes an immediate target the moment it's identified, which raises an uncomfortable question about whether that announcement is a real capability shift or mostly a signal aimed at persuading skeptics in Washington that the conflict is still winnable. The two fronts, Iran and Ukraine, aren't the same conflict, but they share a common thread: escalatory decisions being framed publicly as paths toward negotiation, when historically escalation and negotiation tend to pull in opposite directions rather than the same one. So where does this lead? I don't believe anyone serious is anticipating a negotiated settlement in the near term, not with Tehran declaring in public that it won't fold, and not with Washington unwilling to state a clear political objective that stops short of Iran's total capitulation. What's more probable based on the financial pressure building beneath all this is that the conflict ends the way empires typically wind down commitments they can no longer afford, not through a signed agreement, but through a slow accumulation of pressure: rising borrowing costs, rising oil prices, allied frustration, domestic political exhaustion that eventually forces a quiet withdrawal dressed up as something else. That's the pattern history tends to favor over the tidy diplomatic ending everyone keeps hoping for. Great powers rarely exit commitments like this through negotiation. They exit because they run out of money to stay. And then, often quite suddenly, the withdrawal appears inevitable in hindsight, even though almost nobody predicted its timing in advance. Keep watching the Strait, keep watching the bond market, and treat the first report from any single strike with genuine caution. Because in a conflict with this many parties, this much fog, and this little agreement on what victory even means, the confident narrative you hear in the first hour is almost never the one that holds up by morning.